The Oakland County Child Killer, 1976 to 1977, USA. On March 22, 1977, a driver was slowly making his way down a dark, secluded dirt road in Livonia, Michigan. The winter air was freezing, and patches of dirty snow lined the gravel. As the driver's headlights swept across the roadside, he spotted something unusual lying in a ditch. He slowed his car, pulled over to the shoulder, and stepped out into the biting cold. Walking toward the ditch, he expected to find a discarded pile of clothes or maybe some household trash. But as he got closer, his heart sank. Lying on the frozen ground was 11-year-old Timothy King. He was laid out with bizarre, almost ritualistic care. His hands were folded, and his favorite skateboard was placed neatly right next to his body. But when the investigators and the medical examiner arrived at the scene, they discovered something that was far more terrifying than the murder itself. Timothy had been missing for 6 days, yet his body was completely immaculate. He had been freshly bathed, his fingernails and toenails were meticulously scrubbed, and his clothes had been carefully laundered and pressed. Most shocking of all, an autopsy revealed that Timothy's last meal had been fried chicken. Just days earlier, Timothy's grieving mother had gone on local TV, begging for her son's return, and mentioned that his favorite food was fried chicken. The captor had watched her broadcast, bought Timothy his favorite meal, fed him, bathed him, and then took his life. But to understand how this unthinkable nightmare took hold of Michigan, we have to go back 13 months earlier, to a time when parents in Oakland County still believed their children were safe. In early 1976, Oakland County was a quiet, affluent suburban area northwest of Detroit. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and neighbors never thought to lock their front doors. On the afternoon of February 15, 1976, 12-year-old Mark Stebbins was hanging out at the American Legion Hall in Ferndale, where his mother worked. Mark was a quiet, polite boy who mostly kept to himself. Around 1:30 p.m., Mark called his mother from a payphone to tell her he was leaving the hall and walking the short distance back home. It was a cold, snowy walk, but a routine one. Mark hung up the phone, stepped out into the freezing winter air, and walked into the snow. He never made it home. 4 days later, his body was found in a Southfield parking lot. He had been suffocated, and there were deep rope marks on his wrists and ankles, proving he had been bound and held captive before he died. The community was horrified, but police hoped it was an isolated, tragic incident. Then, 10 months later, on December 22, 1976, 12-year-old Jill Robinson got into a minor argument with her mother about making biscuits for dinner. Frustrated, Jill grabbed her backpack, hopped on her bicycle, and rode off to cool down. She never returned. On the morning of December 26, her body was found alongside Interstate 75 in Troy. She had been shot in the face. Just over a week later, on January 20, 1977, 10-year-old Christine Mihalich walked to a local Berkeley 7-Eleven to buy a Slurpee. She vanished without a trace. 19 days later, her body was found on a quiet road in Franklin Village. A pattern was emerging, and it was deeply disturbing. The public was in an absolute panic. The media began calling the predator the babysitter because of the chilling way the victims were treated. Wayne County Medical Examiner Dr. Werner Spitz noticed a pattern that defied typical criminal behavior. These children weren't killed immediately. They were held captive for days, sometimes weeks. During their captivity, they were kept clean, well-fed, and cared for in a bizarre, twisted imitation of parenting, before they were ultimately murdered and laid out on display in the snow. With the community terrorized, law enforcement launched the largest task force in Michigan history, and in late January 1977, they got what seemed like their golden ticket. Police arrested a local man named Gregory Green on child assault charges. Desperate to negotiate a lighter sentence, Green offered up a stunning piece of information. He told investigators that his close friend, a 26-year-old man named Christopher Bush, was the one who killed Mark Stebbins. Investigators immediately brought Christopher Bush in for questioning. Bush was the son of a highly wealthy and influential General Motors executive, and he lived in an exclusive neighborhood in Bloomfield Township. As detectives questioned Bush, they grew increasingly convinced they had their monster. Not only did Bush have a history of targeting children, but he also casually admitted to detectives that he frequently hung out at the exact locations where Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, and Christine Mihelich had been abducted. The police knew they needed solid proof. They decided to put Bush through a polygraph exam. A rookie examiner attached the sensors to Bush and began asking him about the murders. But to the detective's absolute disbelief, the examiner concluded that Bush passed the test with flying colors. The machine indicated he was telling the truth, because polygraph results were heavily relied upon at the time, and with no other physical evidence connecting him to the crimes, the police had no choice but to lower Bush's bond and release him. But the nightmare was far from over. Shortly after Bush's release, on March 16, 1977, 11-year-old Timothy King vanished after buying candy at a drugstore. When Timothy's clean, bathed body was discovered days later on the side of that Livonia road, the task force was thrown into absolute chaos. The killer was mocking them. Despite chasing down over 20,000 tips, the police eventually hit a brick wall. The leads dried up. The public's terror slowly turned into a numb, lingering dread, and in December 1978, the massive task force was officially disbanded. Just a month before the task force shut down, in November 1978, Christopher Bush was found dead in his Bloomfield Township home from an apparent self-inflicted shotgun wound. With his death, the files were packed away into boxes, and the case of the Oakland County child killer went completely cold for decades. But years later, a new generation of investigators decided to reopen the old files, and what they uncovered was absolutely devastating. First, they reviewed the evidence gathered from Christopher Bush's home after his suicide. In his old bedroom, police had found a hand-drawn sketch of a young boy. Decades later, modern investigators compared the sketch to photographs of Mark Stebbins. The resemblance was uncanny. The sketch appeared to be a detailed drawing of the killer's first victim. Second, investigators located the original charts from Bush's 1977 polygraph test. They handed them over to 3 independent, highly experienced polygraph experts. All 3 experts came back with the same shocking conclusion. The rookie examiner had completely misread the charts. Christopher Bush had not passed. In fact, he had failed the test miserably. He had been lying when he denied involvement in the abductions. Finally, advanced forensic testing on the victim's clothing revealed another piece of physical evidence. Tiny animal hairs were found on the clothes of all 4 children. The hairs belonged to a white dog, the exact breed of dog that Christopher Bush owned at the time of the killings. If those polygraph charts had been read correctly in 1977, Christopher Bush likely would have been arrested. Timothy King might still be alive today, and the families of these 4 children would have received the justice they deserved. Instead, Christopher Bush took his dark secrets to the grave, and the identity of the Oakland County child killer remains officially unsolved to this day. The Burger Chef Murders, 1978, USA. Just after midnight on Saturday, November 18, 1978, a young man named Brian Kring was walking up to the back door of a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana. It was freezing cold, and Brian, who was an off-duty employee, was just stopping by to help his coworkers finish closing up so they could all hang out. But as he reached the door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, stepping into the warm kitchen, and called out. There was no answer. The grills were off, the lights were on, and the restaurant was completely dead silent. Brian walked to the back break room and saw the employees' heavy winter coats still hanging on the hooks. In the middle of an Indiana winter, nobody would leave without their coats. Then he looked at the safe. It was wide open and empty. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He called out again, expecting his friends to jump out from behind a counter and laugh at him. But as the silence stretched, he realized they weren't playing a joke. They were gone. But before Brian could comprehend what had happened, he had no idea of the horror that had just been set in motion. To understand how this mystery began, we have to go back to the start of that Friday shift. The Speedway Burger Chef was a popular local hangout, a fast food joint where kids from the neighborhood could get a quick burger. On this particular evening, 4 young people were on the closing shift. First, there was Jane Freet. Jane was 20 years old, the assistant manager, and she had just been promoted. She was incredibly proud of her job, saving up her money, and drove a white Chevy Vega. Then there was 17-year-old Ruth Ellen Shelton. Ruth was a bright, deeply religious high school student who loved music and was saving up for college. Next was 16-year-old Daniel Davis, a sweet, energetic kid who spent most of his free time working on cars. And finally, there was 16-year-old Mark Flemons. Mark wasn't even supposed to work that night. He was just covering a shift for a friend because he was the kind of guy who could never say no to someone in need. Around 11 p.m., the restaurant officially closed. They began their usual routine, wiping down the stainless steel counters, emptying the fryers, sweeping the floors, and chatting about their plans for the weekend. They were just ordinary kids looking forward to going home. But out in the dark parking lot, someone was watching them. When Brian Kring discovered the empty restaurant and the open safe, he immediately called the police. But when the local Speedway police officers arrived, they made a critical, devastating assumption. Seeing that about $580 was missing from the safe, and knowing that Jane's Chevy Vega was gone from the parking lot, the officers decided this wasn't a kidnapping. They assumed the 4 teenagers had simply decided to steal the cash, abandon their shifts, and go joyriding. In their eyes, it was just a case of teenage rebellion. Because of this theory, the police did not secure the restaurant as a crime scene. Instead, they told the morning shift manager to go ahead and open up for business. By early Saturday morning, employees were walking all over the restaurant, scrubbing the floors with bleach, wiping down the counters, and emptying the trash. Almost every single piece of physical evidence, fingerprints, footprints, DNA, was completely destroyed. But the joyriding theory came to a screeching, horrific halt on Sunday afternoon. A property owner walking through a wooded area in rural Johnson County, about 20 miles away, spotted what looked like bodies lying among the fallen leaves. When police and detectives, including Marion County Sheriff's investigators, arrived at the scene, their worst fears were realized. There, lying in the dirt, still wearing their Burger Chef uniforms, were Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark. The scene was unbelievably violent. Ruth and Daniel had been shot multiple times in the head and neck with a .38 caliber revolver. Jane had been stabbed so violently with a hunting knife that the blade had broken off inside her chest. Mark, who was found a short distance away, had been brutally beaten with a blunt object, possibly a chain, and had choked to death on his own blood. The community was plunged into pure terror. Who could do this to 4 innocent teenagers for less than $600? The pressure on the police was immense, but with the original crime scene completely scrubbed clean, they had almost nothing to go on. They chased down thousands of leads, but every single one of them ended in a dead end. Then, in 1984, 6 years after the murders, a massive breakthrough occurred. A man named Donald Wayne Forrester, who was already serving a prison sentence for an unrelated crime, contacted the police. He claimed he wanted to confess, in exchange for a transfer to a safer prison. Forrester offered to tell them everything. During his interrogation, Forrester gave details that made the detectives' jaws drop. He knew the exact locations where the bodies had been found, and most importantly, he mentioned that the blade of a knife had broken off inside Jane Freet's chest, a highly specific detail that the police had kept strictly hidden from the public. He even claimed that after the murders, he had taken the spent shell casings home and flushed them down his septic tank. The detectives were absolutely certain they had finally solved the Burger Chef murders. But then, the entire case imploded. Word leaked to the press that Forrester was cooperating, and fearing he would face the death penalty instead of getting a lenient deal, Forrester abruptly recanted his confession. He claimed he had made the whole thing up, using details he had heard from other inmates and newspaper articles. When the police tore apart his septic tank to find the shell casings, they found nothing. He was cleared, and the police were right back to where they started. Decades went by, and the case grew cold. But years later, investigators re-examining the files began to piece together a terrifying and far more likely scenario of what happened that night. They looked back at a crucial eyewitness report from the night of the murders. A woman had seen two men standing near the back door of the Burger Chef right around closing time. One was clean-shaven, and the other had a thick beard. Utilizing advanced criminal profiling and looking back at local crime records from 1978, investigators realized there was a notorious gang operating in the area at the time. This crew specialized in robbing fast food restaurants at closing time, and they matched the descriptions of the bearded and clean-shaven men. It is highly likely that on the night of November 17th, this gang waited in the shadows behind the Burger Chef. When one of the teens opened the back door to throw out the trash, the men forced their way inside at gunpoint. They made Jane open the safe and grab the cash. But during the robbery, one of the teenagers, likely Mark Flemons, recognized one of the robbers. Or perhaps the robbers realized that leaving 4 witnesses in a small town was too risky. To eliminate any threat of being identified, the men forced all 4 employees into Jane's white Chevy Vega. They drove them to the isolated woods of Johnson County, where they systematically and brutally executed them to ensure their silence. But because of the catastrophic mistakes made by the police on that first night when the crime scene was literally washed away with bleach, there was never enough physical evidence to bring charges against the members of this fast food robbery crew. By the time investigators truly understood who they were, the key suspects had already died of natural causes or other violence, taking the truth to their graves. The Burger Chef murders officially remain unsolved, leaving the families of Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark to carry the heavy, heartbreaking weight of an injustice that has lasted for nearly 50 years. The witchcraft murder of Charles Walton, 1945, England. On the evening of February 14, 1945, in the quiet, snow-dusted village of Lower Quinton, England, a 33-year-old woman named Edith Walton walked into her cozy stone cottage. She had just finished a long, exhausting day of work and was looking forward to a warm dinner with her 74-year-old uncle, Charles. Charles was a frail man who suffered from severe, painful rheumatism, and he was always home by 4 p.m. to light the hearth and start cooking. But when Edith stepped through the door, the cottage was pitch black and freezing cold. The fireplace was empty, and Charles's favorite armchair sat vacant. Growing uneasy, Edith grabbed a flashlight and recruited a neighbor to walk up the dark, snowy slopes of Meon Hill, where Charles had been working that day. As their flashlights cut through the freezing gloom, they spotted a dark shape huddled near a thick hedgerow. But as they ran closer, they did not just find an old man who had slipped on the ice or gotten lost in the dark. They found Charles Walton pinned to the frozen earth by a heavy pitchfork driven straight through his throat, with a massive curved blade buried deep in his chest. But what made the scene truly bone-chilling was not just the sheer brutality of the crime, it was the bizarre ritualistic way his body had been laid out. But before we get to that, we have to look closer at the quiet, deeply superstitious world of Lower Quinton. Charles Walton was a quiet, eccentric farm laborer who had lived in the village his entire life. Following the death of his sister, Charles had adopted Edith when she was just a toddler, raising her as his own daughter. He was a gentle soul who, despite his physical frailty, was fiercely independent. He loved the local wildlife, and neighbors often remarked on his uncanny, almost supernatural connection with animals. It was said that wild birds would fly down from the trees to eat seeds directly from his palm, and he could calm the most vicious barking guard dogs with just a soft whisper of his voice. But in a clannish, isolated rural village during the height of World War II, this eccentricity was not always seen as a gift. Some of the older, more superstitious villagers began to whisper that Charles's powers came from a much darker source. They whispered that Charles possessed the evil eye. They claimed he kept wild natterjack toads as pets and used them to cast curses on local crops and livestock. The timing of these whispers could not have been worse. The village's harvest of 1944 had been a total disaster, and local cattle had begun dying of mysterious illnesses. In the shadows of the local pubs, desperate farmers began to point fingers, whispering that a witch was living among them, poisoning their livelihoods. On the morning of February 14th, Charles set out for work as he always did. He grabbed his walking stick, a pitchfork, and a heavy billhook, which was a curved, scythe-like tool used for hacking away stubborn hedges. He was wearing a simple, sleeveless work shirt under his coat, completely unfazed by the biting winter air. He said goodbye to Edith, promising to have a warm meal ready when she got home. Multiple witnesses saw the gentle old man walking past the village churchyard, heading toward a farm known as the Firs, owned by a local farmer named Albert Potter. But by nightfall, Charles was dead. When the local police arrived at the gruesome scene on Meon Hill, they immediately realized they were completely out of their depth. The sheer unnatural violence of the murder prompted them to do something highly unusual. They called in Scotland Yard. The Yard sent their absolute star detective, Chief Inspector Robert Fabian, a legendary investigator famously known to the British public as Fabian of the Yard. When Fabian reached the hillside, he was stunned by what he saw. Charles had been beaten over the head with his own wooden walking stick. His neck had been hacked open with the heavy bill hook, which was still deeply embedded in his chest wounds. But the most horrifying detail was the pitchfork. The killer had plunged the metal prongs straight through Charles's neck, pinning him to the earth so violently that the steel prongs had bent against the frozen ground underneath. Furthermore, 2 deep cuts in the shape of a cross had been carved into his chest, and his old tin pocket watch was missing. At first, Fabian and his team focused on an obvious suspect. An Italian prisoner of war from a nearby camp was caught hiding in a ditch shortly after the murder, covered in blood. The local villagers, eager to blame an outsider, were convinced this foreign soldier was the killer. But Fabian's forensic team quickly determined that the blood on the soldier's clothes was rabbit blood from poaching, and his alibi for the afternoon of the murder was completely airtight. With the outsider cleared, Fabian turned his attention to the residents of Lower Quinton. He interviewed all 493 villagers, but he was met with a suffocating wall of silence. The locals refused to speak to the big city detective. As Fabian dug deeper, he realized the village was gripped by a paralyzing fear of the occult. He learned of a local legend about a ghostly black dog that haunted Meon Hill, an omen of death that Charles himself had reportedly seen as a boy. One night, while walking the dark paths of the hill himself, Fabian even saw a large black dog run past, followed by a local boy who fled in absolute terror when Fabian tried to speak to him. The British press caught wind of these stories, and headlines began screaming about human sacrifices, pagan rituals, and witchcraft. It seemed as though the entire case was destined to be swallowed by folklore. But then, Fabian uncovered a highly practical, earthly clue that shattered the supernatural theories. He re-examined the statement of Albert Potter, the farmer who employed Charles. Potter claimed that at 12:40 p.m. on the day of the murder, he had looked up at the hill and seen Charles working. Crucially, Potter specified that Charles was wearing a shirt with sleeves. But when Charles's body was found, he was wearing his sleeveless work shirt, with his sleeved coat neatly folded nearby. Why would Potter claim to see Charles working in a sleeved shirt at a time when Charles was almost certainly already dead? Following this discrepancy, Fabian began investigating Charles's finances. He discovered that when Charles's wife passed away in 1927, She had left him nearly 300 pounds, which was a small fortune for a farmhand at the time. Yet when police checked Charles's bank account, only 3 pounds remained. Edith had no idea where the money had gone, but Fabian soon found the truth. Charles had been quietly lending his savings to local farmers, and his primary debtor was none other than Albert Potter. Potter was a notoriously bad-tempered man who was drowning in debt and facing financial ruin. On the afternoon of February 14, 1945, Albert Potter likely walked up Meon Hill to confront Charles, who had been pressing him for the money he was owed. An argument broke out, and in a fit of rage, Potter snapped. He grabbed Charles's walking stick, beating the frail old man to the ground. As Charles lay helpless, Potter grabbed the billhook, slashing his throat, and then drove the pitchfork through his neck to pin him to the earth. To cover his tracks and exploit the deep, dark superstitions of the local village, Potter carved a cross into Charles's chest and stole his watch, hoping the police would blame a witchcraft cult or a wandering thief. But despite Fabian's brilliant detective work and his absolute certainty of Potter's guilt, the wall of silence in Lower Quinton remained unbreakable. No one would testify against the local farmer, and the frozen ground yielded no usable physical evidence. Albert Potter was never charged, and he took his secrets to the grave. The brutal slaying of Charles Walton remains the oldest unsolved murder in Warwickshire history, leaving the quiet slopes of Meon Hill shrouded in a dark, unsettling silence that has never truly lifted.